Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to part 2 of our next installment of our Declaration of Independence signer series, taking a look, of course, at Joseph Hewes, our second signer from the state of North Carolina. I hope you enjoyed part 1 yesterday. Of course, we took a look at the early life, his time in his early life here in the state of New Jersey. And then, of course, he moved down to Edenton, North Carolina. And from there, we're going to now pick up part 2, where we're going to take a look at his time in the Continental Congress and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And then, of course, what did Joseph Hewes do after the signing of the Declaration of Independence? And then we're going to get to, of course, his death and gravesite and all that stuff that we do here at Dead History. So, let's just jump right in and get right into it. Part 2, Joseph Hewes. Here we go. Joseph Hewes was elected to both Continental Congresses, where he worked tirelessly to remove the causes of American discontent. At first, separation from England was not his idea of the solution at all. But his patience, like Edenton's, had its limits. They were finally reached during the heated congressional debates on independence, when no conciliatory offer came from Great Britain. It seemed to many, including John Adams, that the colonies were about equally divided on the question, 6-4, 6 against. North Carolina, doubtful. Since Joseph Hewes was the only delegate from his state then in Congress, his vote was vital. Let John Adams describe the moment of decision. Mr. Hewes, who had hitherto constantly voted against independence, started upright and lifting up both hands to heaven cried out, "It is done, and I will abide by it." The quiet man's patience had run out. Once committed to independence, Hewes labored feverishly to make it a reality. His work as chairman of the Naval Committee of Congress was outstanding, one of its notable achievements being the commissioning of John Paul Jones in the Continental Navy. Unhappily, Hewes did not live to see the final victory. His consciousness kept him at work day and night for weeks on end. His health, never robust, gave out under the strain, and he died in Philadelphia still on the job. Joseph Hewes was a quiet man who stood at a turning of the road of history, pointing out the hard route to freedom. Joseph Hewes was elected to the First Continental Congress in 1774 and sat on the committee that drew up a Declaration of Rights of the colonies and helped develop Congress's plan for non-importation, which boycotted the importation of British goods. Considering Hewes was an importer by trade, the non-importation pill would have been a tough one to swallow. But he gulped it down anyway, despite the impact it would likely have on his livelihood. In 1775, the pacifist Quakers spoke out against the Continental Congress and their activities, opposing the idea of any violent revolution. Joseph Hewes broke with his Quaker faith, and only he really knows if it was for his love of independence, his love of dancing, or maybe a little of both. He was, after all, still a bachelor, and a high-steppin' Virginia reel was a great way to make time with the ladies. But although he may have been enchanted by them, he, like signer Caesar Rodney, remained a bachelor to the end of his days. When Richard Henry Lee made his resolution to split with Britain in June of 1776, Hewes still felt the action was premature. He initially opposed the resolution, despite the fact that North Carolina's legislature was among the first to give its delegates the go-ahead to vote in favor of independence. But a rousing speech by John Adams finally won Hewes over. Adams wrote about Hewes and his role in turning the tide toward independence on several occasions. Mr. Hewes, who had hitherto constantly voted against it, started upright and lifted up both hands to heaven, cried out, "It is done, and I will abide by it." Adams later said the unanimity of the states finally depended upon the vote of Joseph Hewes and was finally determined by him. While in Congress, Joseph Hewes' shipping background came in quite handy. He played a leading role on the Marine Committee and helped establish the Continental Navy. Today, he is commonly referred to as the first Secretary of the Navy. Perhaps his biggest naval accomplishment was appointing his friend John Paul Jones as an officer and getting him a ship. Jones, of course, went on to become the most celebrated naval hero of the Revolutionary War. Joseph Hewes served in the North Carolina legislature in 1777 and returned to Congress in 1779. By then, he was already ill, most likely from a combination of overwork and undernourishment. Without a wife and family to head home to at night, he thought nothing of working 12-hour days, foregoing food, drink, and downtime. "My country is entitled to my services, and I shall not rink from her cause, even though it should cost me my life," he reportedly said. These words came back to haunt him that fall when, at just 49 years old and too sick to travel home, Joseph Hewes died and was buried in Philadelphia. His funeral was attended by Congress, the General Assembly of Pennsylvania, and other dignitaries. Congressmen wore a crepe around their arms for a month as a sign of mourning. In 1774, Joseph Hewes was elected to the Continental Congress and served until 1777. At the first session, he assisted in the preparation of the Statement of Rights of the colonies. He supported the policy of non-importation, even though it represented losses for his own mercantile business. He spent the entire year of 1776 in Philadelphia. He was a member of the Secret Committee, the Committee of Claims, and the Committee to prepare a Plan of Confederation. In May of 1776, though he felt separation from England was premature, he had to present the Halifax Resolves to the Continental Congress, as they had been enacted by the Provincial Assembly. He wrote an English correspondent, "We do not want to be independent. We want no revolution. But every American to a man is determined to die or be free." Joseph Hewes was the most active member and real head of the committee to fit out armed vessels. As chairman of Marine in 1775, he was the first executive head of the Navy of the United States. His business training and experience as a ship owner made him a wise choice. On December 27th of 1776, Joseph Hewes became a master mason in the Unanimity Lodge Number 7, F&AM, in Edenton, North Carolina. John Adams maintained that all the captaincies should be New Englanders, since they had yielded to the South in selecting George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Joseph Hewes was a friend and benefactor of John Paul Jones. Born John Paul in Kirkbean Parish, Kirkcudbrightshire in Scotland. Interesting long name there. And John Paul Jones at age 12 was a shipboy on a merchantman, and at 21 was master of the John. Following two unfortunate shipboard incidents, both occurring at Tobago, Bahama Islands, he arrived in America in 1773, and for the next 20 months probably lived with or near his older brother, William Paul, at Fredericksburg, Virginia. Joseph Hewes nominated John Paul Jones for a naval appointment, and he became a first lieutenant in the new U.S. Navy on December 22nd of 1775 aboard the Alfred, flagship of Commodore Esek Hopkins' squadron. Gradually, Joseph Hewes' health became impaired, perhaps as a result of his habit of working from 6 in the morning until 5 or 6 in the evening without food or drink. In March of 1776, he became chairman of the Marine Committee. During the July 1st, 1776 debate on Richard Henry Lee's Independence Resolution, Hewes stood up suddenly, lifted both arms to heaven, and cried, "It is done, and I will abide by it." He voted for independence on July 2nd and signed the engrossed copy of the Declaration of Independence on Joseph Hewes on August 2nd. He declined re-election to the Continental Congress for 1777. Joseph Hewes was brought up in the Quaker faith. Prior to the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Hewes had abandoned the Quaker faith completely. He took his nephew Nathaniel Allen Jr., son of his older sister Sarah Hewes Allen, with him when he moved to North Carolina. Nathaniel became his partner and inherited much of his fortune. Hewes became engaged to Isabella Johnson, sister of Samuel Johnston, who was president of the Provincial Assembly and later governor of North Carolina. Isabella died a few days before the date set for their wedding, and he never married. Joseph Hewes died during the 1779 session of the Continental Congress and was buried in Christ Church Cemetery in Philadelphia. In 1932, the U.S. Congress provided a monument honoring Joseph Hewes, which was erected in front of the courthouse in Edenton, North Carolina. In 1963, the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution of North Carolina erected a bronze plaque marking his grave in Christ Church Cemetery in Philadelphia. Joseph Hewes worked with the Whigs to oust the royal government. On April 8th of 1775, Josiah Martin, the royal governor of North Carolina, ordered that the state assembly be dissolved, and on May 3rd, he received direction from Britain to establish a militia composed of loyalists. Patriots assembled in Mecklenburg County on May 8th of 1775 and declared independence from Britain. The action, 5 resolutions, became known as the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. At the time the Patriots acted, they had been informed of the battles at Lexington and Concord. Those sparks in North Carolina began to expand into a rapidly moving force by the end of the month. And on May 31st, the governor fled New Bern and took refuge aboard the HMS Cruiser, which had been on the Cape Fear River. Afterward, Governor Martin was carried to Fort Johnston, but only for a short while. While as the Americans torched the fort on July 18th. Subsequent to the flight of the royal governor, Cornelius Harnett Jr. became president of the Council of Safety, government of the province, making him the chief executive of North Carolina. Joseph Hewes was elected as a member of the provincial legislature installed by the Patriots, and he had also been a member of the Committee of Correspondence prior to being selected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia during 1775. By that time, Hewes had abandoned the Quaker faith and moved far from pacifism. However, he was still unwilling to discount reconciliation with Britain. Hewes was appointed to various committees, including one created on June 14th of 1775 by a resolution of Congress to design rules. Resolved that Mr. George Washington, Mr. Philip Schuyler, Mr. Silas Deane, and Mr. Thomas Cushing and Mr. Joseph Hewes be a committee to bring in a draft of rules and regulations for the government of the Army. June 14th is known as the birthday of the United States Army. On October 13th of 1775, Congress authorized the establishment of the Naval Committee, initially composed of 3 men. 4 others, including John Adams and Joseph Hewes, were added on October 30th. The action was the birth of the United States Navy. Subsequently, Joseph Hewes, as chairman, nominated John Paul Jones to be the commander of the Navy, but Adams, who had earlier agreed to a Virginian, George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, resisted Jones for a man from New England. Eventually, Adams prevailed and Isaac Hopkins was chosen. However, within a year, he was expelled. Joseph Hewes remained in Congress during 1776, but maintained that he was unwilling to break from Britain until just before that fateful decision. During June of 1776, Joseph Hewes refused support for the Resolution for Independence presented by Richard Henry Lee. He continued to ignore North Carolina's instructions to its delegates to vote for independence. However, at some point during the debate, according to John Adams, Joseph Hewes conspicuously reversed his position and loudly exclaimed while still seated with his hands outstretched toward heaven, "It is done, and I will abide by it." His reversal catapulted him into the band of patriots who adopted the Declaration of Independence while pledging their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. In the case of Hewes, there was no pretense of being an orator, nor was he among those who spent much time debating on the floor. However, his contributions to Congress were total commitment and immovable fortitude, but he also backed his support with his fortune. Without hesitation, Hewes also pledged his ships to the cause. His massive knowledge of the maritime industry was an added bonus for Congress as it struggled to neutralize the overwhelming sea power of the British Empire. Hewes was appointed Secretary of the Naval Affairs Committee, a post he retained until his premature death. He also was a member of several other key committees, including the Secret Committee. During 1777, Hewes, who had not been re-elected to Congress, returned to North Carolina to contribute within his home state in the Assembly. In 1779, Hewes was returned to Congress, but by that time, he was in extremely poor health. The stress that plagued all of Congress had, in his case, taken a high toll, and his health had greatly deteriorated. Nonetheless, he resumed his duties and continued to devote his remaining energy to the cause. Soon, all his strength was drained. He last attended on October 29th of 1779. His illness by that time had totally incapacitated him. Joseph Hewes succumbed during the night of November 9th into the 10th of 1779. On the morning of the 10th, Congress was notified of Joseph Hewes' death and that his interment was scheduled for the following evening, Thursday, November 11th, 1779. Congress resolved that Congress will, in a body, attend the funeral tomorrow evening at 3 o'clock with a crepe round the left arm and will continue in mourning for the space of 1 month. Hewes died a bachelor. Early in his career, Hewes became engaged. However, prior to his wedding, his fiancée Isabella Johnston, the sister of Governor Samuel Sam Johnston, died. Joseph Hewes was interred in the cemetery of Christ Church in Philadelphia at a service attended by all of Congress, as well as the General Assembly and the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania. The solemn ceremony was celebrated by the Chaplain of Congress, Bishop White. The memory of Joseph Hewes was honored by a large military force, attended by other dignitaries. He was remembered as one of that outstanding group of patriots who contributed everything within his means to bring about the birth of the nation. Devoid of all ulterior motives and bound only by a sense of unbridled dedication and a high sense of honor, honesty, and integrity until his final breath. Hewes and Caesar Rodney were the only bachelors to sign the Declaration of Independence. In addition to Joseph Hewes, 4 other signers were interred in the Christ Church Cemetery: Benjamin Franklin, Francis Hopkinson, George Ross, and Benjamin Rush. The cemetery remains open to the public and is within walking distance of Independence Hall. Now I'm going to read a little bit from that old, 1800 resource that I use. At length, in the year 1774, a Congress, well known in the annals of the American colonies, assembled in Philadelphia. In that body were 3 delegates from North Carolina, of whom Mr. Hewes was one. The instructions and powers given to the delegates of this Congress by the people of the several colonies were considerably diversified. No public body at that time contemplated a separation from the mother country, and with no powers to this effect were any of the delegates to the Congress of 1774 invested. Their object respected the means most proper to restore harmony between themselves and Great Britain, to obtain redress of grievances which the colonies suffered, and to secure to them the peaceful enjoyment of their unalienable rights as British subjects. No delegates to this Congress carried with them credentials of a bolder stamp than those from North Carolina. They were invested with such high powers as might make any acts done by them or consent given in behalf of this province obligatory in honor upon any inhabitant thereof who is not an alien to his country's good and an apostate to the liberties of America. On the meeting of this Congress, 2 important committees were appointed. The one to state the rights of the colonies in general, the several instances in which these rights are violated or infringed, and the means most proper to be pursued for obtaining a restoration of them. The other, to examine and report the several statutes which affect the trade and manufacturers of the colonies. Of the former of these committees, Mr. Hewes was appointed a member and assisted in preparing their celebrated report. This report contain a temperate but clear declaration of the rights of the English colonies in North America, which were expressed in the following language. Now, just so everyone knows, there's like 10 different points. I'm not going to read them all word for word. You guys could always go Google and look it up. Just to kind of give you an idea, like number one, that they are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and they have never ceded to any sovereign power whatever right to dispose of either without their consent. And then there's number 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10. And then it says, all in each of which the aforesaid deputies, in behalf of themselves and their constituents, do claim, demand, and assist on as their indisputable rights and liberties, which cannot be legally taken from them, altered, or abridged by any power whatever, without their consent, by their representatives in their several provincial legislatures. To the above Declaration of Rights was added an enumeration of the wrongs already sustained by the colonies, after stating which the report concluded as follows. To these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit, but in hopes their fellow subjects in Great Britain will, on a revision of them, restore us to that state in which both countries found happiness and prosperity, we have for the present only resolved to pursue the following peaceable measures. And then it went into like non-importation, non-exportation agreement, that sort of thing. Again, there's a few points. I'm not going to read them word for word. Just wanted to give you an idea of what, they said. Few measures adopted by any session of Congress during the Revolutionary struggle were more remarkable than that of the Congress of 1774, which recommended the system of non-importation. It was a measure dictated by the highest patriotism and proceeded upon the acknowledged fact that the same exalted patriotism which existed among them existed also among the American people. The inefficiency of the measure, it was obvious, must lie in the union of the people to support it. They must adopt and persevere in a system of privation. A willingness to do this generally prevailed throughout the colonies, and to the government of Great Britain was presented the spectacle of 13 colonies adopting a measure, novel perhaps in the history of the world, and supporting it at the sacrifice of a great portion of those comforts which they had been accustomed to enjoy. Although a merchant and one who had been engaged in commercial transactions with England for the space of 20 years, Mr. Hewes cheerfully assisted in forming a plan of the Non-Importation Association and most readily became a member of it. The manner in which Mr. Hewes had acquitted himself during the session of this Congress was so acceptable to the people of North Carolina that he was again appointed to the same high office, and in the month of May of 1775 again appeared at Philadelphia and continued in Congress until the adjournment of that body on the last day of July. During the recess of Congress between July and September, he made a visit to his friends in New Jersey, and in the latter month again resumed his place. From this date until the 29th of October of 1779, Mr. Hewes continued to represent the state of North Carolina, with the exception of something more than a year, during which he devoted himself to his private affairs and to the interests of his state at home. The last time that he appeared in Congress was on the 29th of October of the year last mentioned, after which an indisposition under which he had labored for some time confined him to his chamber, and at length, on the 10th of November, terminated his life in the 50th year of his age. His funeral was attended on the following day by Congress, by the General Assembly of Pennsylvania, the President and Supreme Executive Council, the Minister of France, and a numerous assemblage of citizens. In testimony of their respect for his memory, Congress resolved to wear a crepe around the left arm and to continue in the mourning for the space of 1 month. Although the events in the life of Mr. Hewes, which have been able to collect, are few, they perhaps sufficiently speak his worth as a man of integrity, firmness, and ardent patriotism. To this may be added that in personal appearance he was prepossessing and characterized in respect to his disposition for great benevolence and in respect to his manners for great amenity. He left a large fortune, but no children to inherit it. So I'm going to read from a couple more sources here. As the movements towards increased intercolonial cooperation and colonial independence from Britain gathered momentum during the early 1770s, Hewes assumed a place among the Whig leadership of the colony. On December 4th of 1773, the North Carolina Assembly, in response to a Virginia resolution, created a committee of correspondence. The committee consisted of Joseph Hewes, Speaker of the House John Harvey Jr., Robert Howell, Cornelius Harnett, William Hooper, Richard Caswell, Edward Vail, John Ashe, and Samuel Johnston. These men would become the Revolutionary High Command of the colony. In the spring of 1774, the committee approved a Massachusetts circular proposing that an intercolonial Congress be convened in Philadelphia to formalize opposition to British tyranny. Forced to meet in extra-legal session due to Governor Josiah Martin's refusal to convene a regular meeting, members of the Assembly met in New Bern on August 25th, approved Hewes' report of the Committee of Correspondence, and on August 27th, selected Hewes, Caswell, and Hooper as the colony's delegates to the Continental Congress. Joseph Hewes and William Hooper arrived in Philadelphia on September 14th. Soon after taking his seat, Joseph Hewes became acutely aware of the lack of unity among the delegates. On one extreme were the advocates of an uncompromising defense, by force if necessary, of American rights, led by the representatives of Massachusetts, Virginia, and South Carolina. The opposition, led by the representatives of Pennsylvania and New York, argued for reconciliation with the Crown and were willing to recognize a wide latitude of parliamentary authority over colonial affairs. The majority of the delegates, including those of North Carolina, found themselves somewhere between the two extremes. These moderate Whigs favored reconciliation with Britain, but they also stressed the need for guarantees against further infringements on American liberty. In succeeding weeks, the moderates were able to control the tone of the debates and the actions of the Congress. After it adjourned on October 26th of 1774, Joseph Hewes remained in Philadelphia to renew old friendships and visit relatives. He also traveled to New York on business. In late November, he returned to Edenton, suffering from an intermittent fever and ague, maybe ague. In all probability, Hewes had malaria, a disease common in Edenton due to the mosquito-infested swamps surrounding the town. His health had also deteriorated under the effects of the cold weather and heavy workload in Philadelphia. However, his activities in North Carolina from November of 1774 to April of 1775 allowed little time for rest and recuperation. His mercantile firm, which had been reorganized with Robert Smith as Hewes and Smith, was valued at £20,000 in 1774. In addition, Hewes owned a shipyard on the bay south of Edenton. While attending to business affairs, he also served on Edenton's Committee of Safety, which was responsible for enforcing the Continental Association in the port of Roanoke. By early of 1775, the work of the moderate Whigs throughout the colonies for peaceful reconciliation with Britain had suffered massive setbacks. The failure of the Crown to consider the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, Parliament's rejection of the conciliatory proposals of Lords North and Chatham, the declaration that a state of rebellion existed in Massachusetts, and the ordering of 10,000 additional troops to Boston provided evidence that George III had chosen force to answer colonial complaints. This somber realization was pressed home in late April when news of the battles of Lexington and Concord reached Joseph Hewes and the other delegates as they prepared to return to Philadelphia. When the Continental Congress reconvened, Hewes began to urge North Carolina to strengthen its defenses. To counter Governor Martin's efforts among the colony's loyalists, Hewes enlisted the aid of Presbyterian ministers in Philadelphia. First, a pamphlet was written for distribution to Highland Scot immigrants explaining the work of the Continental Congress. In November of 1775, two of the ministers traveled south with instructions drafted by Hewes to further stem the tide of loyalism in North Carolina. Because of failing health and in order to attend the colony's third provincial congress, Hewes left Philadelphia 6 days before the August 1st adjournment of the Continental Congress. His stay in North Carolina, though brief, was marked by participation in the organization of a provincial government for the colony and in the authorization to raise the colony's quota of Continental troops. On October 22nd, he rejoined his fellow delegates in Philadelphia. Among his committee assignments during this session, his service on the Naval Board proved to be the most exhaustive and most significant. From November of 1775 to February 1776, he served as the board's secretary, keeping its business records and conducting much of its voluminous correspondence. Possibly one of Hewes' most noteworthy achievements on the board was to secure John Paul Jones' first commission in the Continental Navy. In 1776, King George III not only rejected the Olive Branch Petition, but also proclaimed the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. This was closely followed by the Congress's authorization for independent governments in each colony. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine's incendiary Common Sense appeared, and against Joseph Hewes' urgings, was sent to North Carolina for distribution. The following month, Governor Martin's efforts among the Loyalists reached fruition, only to be thwarted by Patriots at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. The final blow to moderate hopes came in March with news of the Crown's Prohibitory Act closing colonial ports and placing the colonies under military rule. Joseph Hewes stated that nothing is left now but to fight it out. All hope of reconciliation had vanished, and separation from England was now formally debated in the Continental Congress. Hewes' pleas for instructions from North Carolina on the issue of independence were answered on April 12th by the 4th Provincial Congress meeting at Halifax. The colony's delegates were told to concur with the delegates of the other colonies in declaring independency. On June 7th, Virginia's Richard Henry Lee introduced the long-awaited resolution, which was approved in the final form on July 4th of 1776. Some historians have stated that Joseph Hewes was openly indecisive on the issue of declaring independence from Britain. The basis for this assertion lies in John Adams' letter to William Plumer, dated March 28th of 1813. But records of the Continental Congress specifically those covering the period from March to July 1776, provide no support for Adams' recollection. Rather, these records, coupled with the writings of other delegates, show Adams to be in error. It has been argued that Adams, in his letter to Plumer, was recalling the action of South Carolina's Edward Rutledge rather than those of Joseph Hewes. Whatever the nature of Adams' confusion may have been, Hewes' attitude from March to July of 1776 is clear from his correspondence. He supported independence. This decision was made reluctantly, but once made, there was no infirmity of will or allegiance. In March of 1776, Hewes became a revolutionary, albeit a reluctant one, but a revolutionary just the same. Early in August of 1776, Hewes left Philadelphia for a much-needed recess from public employment. For almost a year, he had been at work in that city, and from March through July, he had carried the entire workload of the North Carolina delegation alone. His health, already poor, by August had deteriorated to a dangerous degree. He complained of continual headaches, high fevers, and fading vision. His hope for rest had to be postponed, for shortly after returning to Edenton, he was elected the borough's representative to the 5th Provincial Congress. The main concern of this Congress, which met in Halifax during November to December of 1776, was the drafting of a state constitution. This proved to be a most divisive process. The Conservatives, led by Samuel Johnston, James Iredell, and Joseph Hewes, supported a political system based on a strong executive and property qualifications for suffrage and office holding. In vehement opposition were the Radicals, led by Willie Jones and Thomas Person, who argued for the establishment of a direct democracy. The Constitution, as adopted on December 14th, improved the political position of the lower classes, but far from satisfied either faction. The debates over the document did produce one unfortunate result: an embittered and continuing division in the ranks of the North Carolina Whigs. Following the adjournment of the Provincial Congress, Joseph Hewes was able to rest in Edenton for a few months. Late in March 1777, his health had improved to the extent that he was planning to return to Philadelphia and the Continental Congress. That the state's General Assembly would fail to appoint him was never considered. However, when the Assembly convened on April 7th, the previous conservative radical factionalism reappeared in all its bitterness, and the major point of contention became the reappointment of Joseph Hewes as delegate to the Continental Congress. Led by John Penn, the Radicals accused Joseph Hewes of plural office holding, a violation under the new state constitution, and of reaping personal profit from his position as delegate. After many days of emotional debate, Hewes was bypassed and Penn was appointed as delegate. Although this defeat was a harsh one for Hewes, a more significant result may have been the withdrawal of many conservatives, notably William Hooper, from politics. Feeling that his reputation had been unjustly smeared, Joseph Hewes retired from public life, refusing in both 1777 and 1778 to stand for Edenton's seat in the General Assembly. For 2 years, he devoted his attention to regaining his health and supervising his extensive business affairs. Early in 1779, however, he acceded to popular demand and returned to the General Assembly. Soon after taking his seat, he allowed his name to be placed in nomination as a delegate to the Continental Congress. This time his election was not contested. Soon after his arrival in Philadelphia, Hewes was appointed to the Treasury and Marine Committees two of the Congress's most important and busiest standing committees. Within a month, he received 2 additional assignments. By the middle of August of 1779, Joseph Hewes wrote that he again suffered from severe headaches, and by late September, he was so ill that he could not walk to Carpenter's Hall. On October 29th, sensing that he could no longer fulfill his duties as delegate, Hewes submitted his resignation. Unable to travel, he remained in Philadelphia, hoping that complete rest would restore his strength. However, his health was beyond repair, and he died about 2 weeks later at the age of 49. When news of Hewes' passing reached the Continental Congress, the delegates voted to attend the funeral as a body and proclaimed a 1-month period of mourning. At 3 p.m. on November 11th, a most distinguished gathering met at Hewes' rooming house and escorted the body to Christ Church for burial. The Pennsylvania Packet, in its 16 November obituary, paid a deserved tribute to Joseph Hewes and to the devotion to duty which his life exemplified. His mind was constantly employed in the business of his exalted station until his health, much impaired by intense application, sunk beneath it. The only likeness of Hewes is a 1 3/4 inch by 1 5/8 inch miniature painted on ivory by Charles Willson Peale in 1776. The oval portrait was framed as a lady's brooch and was a gift from Hewes to Helen Blair, the niece of Isabella Johnston. The miniature is now owned by the U.S. Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis, Maryland. So, before I read you my last, actually there's a couple of more sources that I'm going to use, but nearing the end of this part 2, and I found ourselves a very special guest. Hello, Mr. Henry.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good.
Nobody can hear you. You got to get closer. How are you?
I'm good.
There you go. So what's new?
Nothing.
What's going on? Anything?
Nope.
What do we got? Only a few weeks before Christmas now.
Yeah.
And what did we find out? Where are we going December 21st?
The White House.
That's right. We're going to the White House. Very cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
And why don't you tell the people, Henry? I told you a very, very, very funny video about my trip to Philadelphia, right? I'm gonna tell the people about it. No. I'm gonna tell the people about it in bonus footage.
Okay.
Is it funny?
Yes.
Well, the people think it's pretty funny?
Oh, yes.
Yeah? All right, well, thanks for stopping in. Joseph Hewes, our next declaration signer, born in? No, he was signed for the state of North Carolina.
Jersey.
There you go, born in New Jersey. Well, thanks for stopping in, Henry.
You're welcome.
And we'll see you soon, right? We'll see you next week for next week's signer, right?
Yes.
All right.
I will.
All right, thanks, Henry.
Welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So again, just reading from other sources, I don't want to repeat too much because I know this video is getting a little long, but, I wanted to make sure that I definitely covered everything, of course. 1774, Hewes was elected to represent North Carolina in the Continental Congress that was assembling in Philadelphia. He was a member of the Committee to State the Rights of the Colonies. In this, he assisted in preparing North Carolina's celebrated report known later as the Halifax Resolves. Basically, we know all that. Because of his shipping interests with England for over 20 years, Hewes was well known outside North Carolina. Though it meant a personal loss when he became involved in activities leading up to the Revolutionary War, Hewes supported a policy of ceasing commercial relationships with Britain, and he cheerfully assisted in forming a plan for non-importation. In the beginning of 1775, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, to which he and his family belonged, held a general convention denouncing the proceedings of Congress. Joseph Hewes, being a true patriot, came to feel that a revolution in the colonies was inevitable. He severed his connection with the society, the Quakers, and became a promoter of war against Britain. He threw off other restraints also imposed by the Quakers. He went to dances whenever possible, and it is said that he appreciated the company of the ladies. Quite the ladies' man, Mr. Joseph Hewes. On the advice of the committee appointed October 5th of 1775, Congress voted to fit out 4 vessels. A committee of 7 was formed by Congress for the defense of the United Colonies. By this vote, Congress was fully committed to the policy of maintaining a naval armament. This committee was the first executive body for the management of naval affairs. It was known as the Naval Committee, and the members were as follows: John Langdon of New Hampshire, John Adams of Massachusetts, Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island, Silas Deane of Connecticut, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, and Joseph Hewes of North Carolina, and Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina. Hewes chaired the committee that was responsible for fitting out the first American warships. He also put his entire fleet at the disposal of the Continental Armed Forces. The disbursements of the Naval Committee were under his special charge, and 8 armed vessels were fitted out with the funds placed at his disposal. North Carolina, on April 12th of 1776, authorized their delegates to the Continental Congress to vote for independence. This was the first official action by a colony calling for independence. The 83 delegates present in Halifax at the 4th Provincial Congress unanimously adopted the Halifax Resolves. So, pretty interesting. In May of 1776, Joseph Hewes presented the Halifax Resolves to the Continental Congress, and the last line of the document read, "Resolved that the delegates for this colony in the Continental Congress be empowered to concur with the other delegates of the other colonies in declaring independence." I think I actually read some of this earlier, but it basically just went on. I'm not going to read it all word for word. That was the first line. Just basically says that, North Carolina is agreeing with coming together and uniting with the other colonies. Joseph Hewes, who considered the resolves premature, ignored his state's commitment and at first opposed Richard Henry Lee's June 7th independence resolution. According to John Adams, however, at one point during debate, a transformation came over Hewes, and we know that, of course. When he stood up, "It is done, and I will abide by it." We know that, of course. In a letter to his friend James Iredell on June 28th of 1776, Joseph Hewes expressed his confidence in the forthcoming debate on independence. On Monday, the great question of independence and total separation from all political intercourse with Great Britain will come on. It will be carried, I expect, by a great majority, and then I suppose we shall take upon us a new name. Joseph Hewes was a friend and benefactor of John Paul Jones. John Paul was a shipboy on a merchantman from Scotland, and at 21 was master of a brigantine. He arrived in America in 1773, John Paul Jones, and became a friend of Joseph Hewes. When the time came to appoint the nation's first naval captains, Hewes and John Adams clashed for one of the positions. Hewes nominated his friend John Paul Jones, we know that, and feeling that he had to pick a northerner, John Adams, of course, went with the other gentleman, and his name is escaping me right now, and I can't imagine why it is. And that is actually who got the position, and I can't believe Esek Hopkins. That was what it was. Esek Hopkins. And he's the one that got the position, but then, like a year later, he was removed from that position, and John Paul Jones took it over. Here's kind of an interesting thing. John Paul Jones never forgot his patron and sponsor, meaning Hewes, and many letters are extent telling of the great gratitude he felt for Hewes' interest in him. The following is an excerpt from one of the letters. "You are the angel of my happiness, since to your friendship I owe my present enjoyments, as well as my prospects. You more than any other person have labored to place the instruments of success in my hands." In 1776, Hewes was the member of the secret committee of the Committee on Claims, virtually the first Secretary of the Navy. John Adams would often boast that he and Hewes laid the foundation, the cornerstone of the American Navy. With General Washington, Hewes conceived the plan of operations for the ensuing campaign and voted in favor of the immediate adoption of the Declaration, North Carolina being the first in the colonies to declare in favor of throwing of all connection with Great Britain. He was also on the committee to prepare the Articles of Confederation. Hewes was not selected as a delegate to Continental Congress in 1777, as we know. Despite this, the Assembly employed Hewes to fit out 2 vessels. He declined, however, because he was already an agent for the Continental Congress regarding shipping. When the House of Commons met in 1779, Hewes was again there as an elected member of the House of Commons. A letter signed G. Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army to Joseph Hewes, August 25th of 1779, responds to Hewes' asking Washington to help gain the enlargement release of a friend, Mr. Granbury, captured by the British. Washington replied with his opinion that trading captured British soldiers for captured American civilians would only motivate the British to capture more civilians. Because of his poor health, Hewes sent his resignation to the General Assembly in late 1779. However, he died in Philadelphia on November 10th, 1779, before he could return to his home in Edenton, North Carolina. He was the only signer of the Declaration of Independence who died at the seat of government. His remains were followed to the grave in Christ Church Cemetery by Congress in a body and a large concourse of the citizens of Philadelphia. Congress resolved that they would attend the funeral with a crepe round the left arm and continue in mourning for 1 month. It was suggested that a committee also be appointed to superintend the ceremony and that the Reverend Mr. White, their chaplain, should officiate on the occasion. Today, a marker commemorates Hewes, but the site of his grave is unknown. In 1894, the Guilford Courthouse National Military Park in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to reinter the remains of the 3 signers and erect a monument. William Hooper and John Penn were reburied in the park in 1894, but Joseph Hewes' unmarked grave could not be located in Christ Church in Philadelphia. The monument to the 3 signers was erected over the new graves of Hooper and Penn and was dedicated on July 3rd of 1897. The monument is inscribed, "In Memoriam, William Hooper and John Penn, delegates from North Carolina, 1776 to the Continental Congress and signers of the Declaration of Independence. Their remains were reinterred here in 1894. Hewes' grave is lost. He was the 3rd signer." Joseph Hewes' memorabilia is quite extensive in addition to the preceding memorial. Close by the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., as I've told you guys in the past, is a special memorial park celebrating each of the 56 signers of the Declaration. There is a granite boulder engraved with the name of Joseph Hewes. In the rotunda at the National Archives building nearby is a large mural painting by Barry Faulkner showing several signers, including Joseph Hewes, who is shown on the extreme left in the top row. In the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol is the famous painting by John Trumbull entitled The Declaration of Independence. And Joseph Hewes is shown seated with a group of 10 figures. He's the third from the right to the left of the figure of John Adams. 2 naval ships have been named in honor of Joseph Hewes. During World War II, 16 shipyards on both coasts built Liberty ships. The ships were initially named after famous Americans, starting with the signers of the Declaration of Independence. The USS Joseph Hewes AP-50 was launched in 1942. The ship was sunk by a German torpedo along the North African coast. The second ship was a Knox-class frigate, USS Joseph Hewes, FFT-1078, commissioned in 1971 as a destroyer escort. The ship made a cruise to Vietnam in 1972, participating in a gunfire support role off the coast of Quang Tre, Vietnam. The ship was decommissioned on June 30th of 1994, and she was sold that same day to the Taiwanese Navy and renamed the Lang Yang. So then there's a lot of information on like Wikipedia about Joseph Hewes that really it's the same stuff we just went over about, First Continental Congress. We went over all that, of course, and all the committees he was on, and then the Second Continental Congress, of course, and then the second session of the Second Continental Congress, and John Adams and his comments that he made about Joseph Hewes, the naval affairs regarding Joseph Hewes, the 5th North Carolina Provincial Congress, the 1st North Carolina General Assembly, and then being reelected to Continental Congress, all those things. I'm not going to read all that stuff again because we really did go over it. Now, one thing I do want to touch on is Joseph Hewes and slavery. I always like to kind of touch on these things. Joseph Hewes 100% was a slave owner. He did own enslaved people. Just to give you some excerpts on things that I read, Joseph Hewes was also active in the Continental Congress in non-naval matters. Joseph Hewes sided with fellow North Carolina delegate Edward Rutledge in demanding the Declaration allow slavery. While Hewes was raised as a Quaker, he was indeed also a slave owner and a supporter of slavery. Now, Edward Rutledge, I'm pretty sure, was a South Carolina delegate, so I think that's wrong saying that. But it's just kind of going over the point of Hewes and slavery. Here's some more information regarding Hewes and slavery. Even by 1755, it was clear that the Quakers were going one way while Joseph Hewes was going another. The Quakers were moving against ownership of enslaved people, while Hewes was clearly moving towards it. In 1758, the Quakers decided that Quakers must free their slaves. Enforcement of this policy was generally ineffective until 1775, when ownership was banned and those members who failed to free their slaves were disowned. Joseph Hewes' business as a merchant depended on a reliable source of enslaved labor, and thus given a choice between Quaker membership and his business, he certainly would have chosen the latter. So, there you go there. 22 members of the Arch Street Monthly Meeting signed the certificate, including one of the leading opponents of slavery, who was not Joseph Hewes. That's the Arch Street Meeting House in Philadelphia. Here you go. Here's some more. Joseph Hewes imported 21 slaves in September of 1771. 16 slaves arrived from Antigua on September 4th on the 60-ton brig Joseph Roger Pye Master. On September 13th, the 70-ton sloop Commerce, John Cunningham Master, arrived from St. Croix, delivering 5 slaves. So that just shows you Hewes imported 21 different slaves. There was another vessels carrying slaves to North Carolina, and Joseph Hewes was definitely involved in importing some of those slaves. So that's some more about Joseph Hewes. This is actually a letter. It's signer Joseph Hewes' accounts for his slaves and other property. It's an actual handwritten letter by Joseph Hewes. It says, manuscript document signed Joseph Hewes. It's a schedule of the taxable property of Joseph Hewes, exclusive of what he has in company with Robert Smith, delivered on October 16th of 1777 to Joseph Blount, Esquire. The account lists all his land holdings, including 120 acres of land or thereabouts adjoining the town of Edenton, which also contained a house and kitchen together with 50 acres and a house, adjoining the land known by the name of McGrath's. In addition, he held 225 acres of land in Tyrrell County and 100 acres in Dauphin County, as well as urban property in Edenton, including stores, kitchen, stable, and hattership, warehouse, wharf, etc. The tax schedule also includes the names of Hewes' 10 slaves, including Frank, Gunn, Cuff, Will, James, Townside, Yarmseth, Sam, Hardy, and Tenny. Hewes adds his name just below the names of his slaves. So, there you go. That definitely tells you right there that, you know, he definitely was, an owner of enslaved people. There's another thing here that has taxable property, and it lists all his taxable enslaved males and taxable enslaved females. And I'm going to read you some of the names of Actually, I'm going to read you all of the names because I feel it's important. These were all owned by Joseph Hewes from 1768 through 1779. These are the taxable enslaved males that Joseph Hewes owned and enslaved. Sam, Will, Tom, Frank, Sundon, Mingo, Cuff, Hannibal, Cato, James, Abraham, David, George, Lewis, we said Frank, 400 pounds, Gunn, 450 pounds. This is, I guess, their worth or what he bought them for. Pounds meaning, obviously, the Britain and English currency. Cuff, 300 pounds. Will, 120 pounds. Sam, 400 pounds. Hardy, 500 pounds. Then there was a Charles, an Anthony, a Rop, Harry, Peter, Jack, Polydone, Sandy, Isaac, Denny, Frank, a cripple, Cuff, a cripple, Gunn, about 45 years old, Will, 50 plus years old, Sam, about 35 years old, Peter, 6 months old, and Sam, 4 years old. Yes, these were enslaved males, 6 months old and 4 years old. Now, the enslaved females' names were Nan, Tony, who has 400 pounds next to her name. And then it lists Peg, who was 12 years old, Tenny, who was 25 years old, Betty, about 40 years old, Maritata, 3 years old, Hannah was 2 years old, Rachel was 25 years old, Joan was 4 years old, Flora was about 40 years old, and Momini was 7 years old. So, this is tough to even look at and read. Again, just such a dark, terrible thing in our history, but it is part of history. You can't ignore it. You can't run away from it. Many of these founding fathers were slave owners and did hold enslaved people. So I think it's important when we find information about their names to definitely read it and let people know who they were, because so little is ever record keeping of these people, and they deserve for their names to be known, in my opinion. So last but not least, Joseph Hewes, of course, died November 10th, 1779, 8 months short of his 50th birthday. Of course, the funeral was held the following day. So it just says that, let's see, the morning, and they further resolved that Mr. Harnett, Mr. Sharp, and Mr. Griffin to be a committee to superintend the funeral, and that the Reverend Mr. White, the attending chaplain, should be notified to officiate on the occasion. Accordingly, 3 o'clock that evening, the corpse was carried in procession to Christ Church. Mr. Carrollton, Mr. Troop, Mr. Dean, Mr. Brown, Mr. Pennell, and Colonel Adams supported the pall. Beside the President and members of Congress as mourners, the General Assembly, a number of officers, both civil and military, attended the funeral. A divine service had been performed by the Reverend Mr. White, rector of the Episcopal churches in this city, and one of the chaplains of Congress. The corpse was interred in the cemetery adjoining that of Mr. Drayton. So there you go. Mr. Hewes, having at an early period demonstrated his zealous attachment to the cause of American freedom, he was appointed by the voice of his fellow citizens a delegate to the First Congress, and from that time to his death enjoyed the fullest confidence of his country. Endued with strong decisive genius and a spirit of industry, his mind was constantly employed in the business of his exalted station, until his health, much impaired by intense application, sunk beneath it. His private life was mild and amicable, as his public life was honorable and useful. Adorned with all the social virtues, esteemed by his acquaintance, beloved by his friends, and resigned to his fate, unregretting, though deeply regretted, his last debt to nature was paid in the service of his country. And that's going to do it, guys. I know this part 2 ran a bit long, and guess what? You got to stay tuned, because we have awesome bonus footage and a really funny story for you guys in the bonus footage. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you enjoyed this look at Joseph Hewes, our second signer from the state of North Carolina. Thanks so much, guys, for everything, all the support, the subscribes, the likes, the comments, the questions, all of it. Thank you so very much. We appreciate it greatly. And stay tuned for next week. Our last North Carolina signer, believe it or not. Our last one, John Penn, will be next week. And then after that, we move on to a new state. So yes, next week, John Penn. And then we're done with the state of North Carolina. So thank you so much, guys. Stay tuned for that bonus footage. I hope you're going to love it. And we will see you next week for another installment of this Declaration of Independence Signer series. Thanks, guys. See you next week. Bye-bye now. Hey guys, TJ with Dead History. I'm actually at the Stony Brook Quaker Meeting House Cemetery here in Princeton, New Jersey. Let me turn you guys around. So, as you see that building there with the smoke coming out, we're going to get to that in a second. So this old cemetery, as you see, very old cemetery, this is actually the burial place. You can kind of see a big monument up there of Richard Stockton, a Declaration signer from New Jersey. Now, the reason we're here is not because of Richard Stockton today. It's actually because Aaron Hewes, that's Joseph's father, Joseph Hewes' father, Aaron Hewes, is somewhere in this cemetery. He is buried here somewhere. Now, I don't have the cemetery records. As you see, a lot of these headstones have sunk down, and you really can't see them very well. So to tell you exactly which one of these is Aaron Hewes, I don't know. I may be able to do a little bit more research and find out, but I don't exactly know which marker or which plot is Aaron Hewes, but he is here somewhere. Joseph Hewes' father is in this cemetery somewhere. It's not a very big cemetery, as you can see. It's pretty small, actually. And that building that we're going to get to in a second, that's actually the Stony Brook Quaker Meeting House building. You can see the smoke coming out of the chimney up there. That's where Joseph Hewes went to school as a young boy. So we're going to show you that too. I'm just trying to look here, see if I can see anything that says Hewes, but I don't think I'm going to have a whole lot of luck with that, unfortunately. I think you would kind of need, you would probably kind of need the exact, because you got to remember, his father died, probably back in the 1760s or so, I would guess. I have the date, I could actually look it up. But yeah, I mean, you're probably talking 1760s, if not earlier than that. So quite a long time ago this was. And record keeping was not the greatest, of course, back then. So it's kind of really hard to say where Aaron Hewes would be in here. But according to records, he's definitely in here somewhere. Just don't know where. So there you go, guys. Aaron Hewes' grave site, or the cemetery that he is in, here in Princeton. Joseph Hewes' father. So pretty cool stuff. Thanks, guys. Hey guys, TJ with Dead History. So I did not record any audio here inside the church. Where I'm at is the Christ Church in Philadelphia. The Christ Church, it was actually originally built, I believe, in like 1727, somewhere around that time. Very old. The reason I'm here is this is actually the church where Joseph Hewes' funeral took place. And the bishop, who was the Congress's chaplain, Bishop William White, this is his grave site that you're seeing. You'll see an actual grave on the floor of the church. He's actually interred inside of a vault right underneath the floor of the church. That is Bishop William White's grave site that you're seeing. William White was the priest, or the bishop, I should say, that was the person who presided over the funeral of Joseph Hewes. He is the person who actually conducted the funeral of Joseph Hewes, William White. So that's his gravesite, and this is the church, Christ Church in Philadelphia, where the funeral of Joseph Hewes took place. So I wanted to show you guys this. Pretty interesting stuff, I thought, and pretty amazing, incredible, the preservation of this beautiful, beautiful old church here in Philadelphia. So hope you guys enjoy this video and these photos. Thanks. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History. And where am I? I wonder. I'm actually at the Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And let me flip you guys around. Because here in this very historic graveyard and cemetery, where many Declaration signers are, we find the gravesite of Joseph Hewes. So there you go, guys. Joseph Hewes, right here, born January 23rd of 1730, died November 10th of 1779, delegate to all 5 provincial congresses, member of Continental Congress, signer of the Declaration from North Carolina, first executive head of the Navy, one of the best and most agreeable men in the world. Buried in Christ Church Burial Ground, Philadelphia. Now, here's the great thing about Joseph Hewes' gravesite. You would think, well, is it like this headstone? It's not. I mean, maybe it could be technically, but I don't believe it is, because there is question where the heck he is buried here. And as you see, this is not him up here either. So, is it this? Because the question is, they don't know where he's buried. He's definitely in this cemetery somewhere, but they're not exactly sure where. So that is in question, so to speak. So, but here you go. Here is Joseph Hewes, our Declaration signer's gravesite at Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia. A very historic cemetery, of course. Hey guys, TJ with Dead History. So, I promised you guys a funny story, and I will deliver. As you look at my photos from the gravesite of Joseph Hewes at the Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's the Christ Church Burial Ground, which is right around the corner from Independence Hall, and it's also right around the corner from Christ Church itself. So, long story short, I drove to Princeton to see Joseph Hewes' birthplace, and then his parents' grave, and all that stuff. And then I drove over to Philadelphia. This was on a Sunday, and I at first stopped and parked in front of the Christ Church, and I went inside and took my video and photos. And then I got in the car and drove around the block, only about 2 blocks away or so, 3 blocks away, to where the Christ Church Burial Ground is. And you can park right on the street. There's plenty of parking. So I parked in a spot that I thought was fine, of course. I walked into the cemetery, and I visited Joseph Hewes' gravesite. And Benjamin Franklin is also buried there, so I briefly stopped and looked at his grave, which I've seen many times. I was in the cemetery for maybe all of 10 minutes, not even. Me and the worker there, because you have to pay a small $5 fee to enter the burial ground, the Christ Church Burial Ground, site there, the grounds, because it is a historic, preservation type thing. Well worth it, of course. Even the guy who was, taking the money for the tickets to get in, he even said, "You weren't even in here for 10 minutes." So I was in there for less than 10 minutes. I walk out of the burial ground and, dude, where's my car? Like that old silly movie. I think Ashton Kutcher was in it. My car was gone. So I first thought, oh my Lord, my car was stolen. I'm in a big city, Philadelphia. Maybe my car was stolen. Well, after about 2 minutes of that panic, I realized, no, my car was not stolen. It looks like maybe possibly I was parked in a no parking zone and my car was towed. So long story short, I had to make several phone calls to try to find where my car was. This was a big effort. And I finally got a hold of someone who told me that it was indeed towed by the Philadelphia Parking Authority and that my car was in a lot already. I mean, this is how quick they do this in Philadelphia. And unfortunately, from where I was at the burial ground, even in a car, the lot where my car was taken was about a 10-minute drive. So to walk it would have been probably 40 minutes to an hour. And I was not doing that. So I had to call an Uber, which cost me $13 to bring me from the burial ground to the parking lot where my car was being held. And then I had to pay $250 to get my car out of the tow parking lot, the tow lot. So it cost me $265 roughly to pay a visit to Joseph Hewes' gravesite. And, the funny thing is, looking back, it is kind of comical, of course. While I was standing there initially, before I really realized my car was towed, and I thought my car might have been stolen, and then even when I realized it was towed, these thoughts were still going through my head. I'm thinking, I'm at least 1 hour away from my home, driving time, at least 1 hour. So who am I going to have come pick me up in Philadelphia to bring me home to New Jersey, and then the next day on a Monday, because again, I was there on a Sunday, bring me back to Philadelphia to get my car out of tow? Luckily, that didn't have to happen, but, and I do stay very calm during these situations usually, and I was calm, but man, talk about craziness. Even the young man who worked at the Christ Church burial ground, the one who I said told me I was in there for less than 10 minutes, that young man, he even said, man, the Philadelphia Parking Authority, they are ruthless. They literally, you turn around within 2 minutes and they will tow you. That's how they are. So, pretty funny story looking back on it. But yes, my visit to Joseph Hewes' gravesite cost me almost $300. So, enjoy that, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much. See you next week.